Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader, and welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do as you discover, develop, and deploy your own unique Black Belt leader within. I heard a conversation while grabbing some groceries the other day that caught my attention. A mother was talking to her son and was asking him why he got a failing grade on a math exam at school. Now, as I hear all too often, he started his response with a simple phrase that you and I probably used at some point in our lives. Well, Mom, the reason is, and then he went on to give this long, drawn-out explanation as to why he didn't have time to study. Well, it started because he was too busy between basketball practice and working part-time to have time to study during the week. And the night before the exam, he planned to cram that night, but his girlfriend was having a bad day. And so he had to spend 2 or 3 hours texting her back and forth to help her feel better, all while he watched his favorite NBA team play basketball on TV, hoping to pick up some tips for the Friday night game. Well, I was slowly listening to the conversation, taking some time picking groceries because I wanted to hear the end of the story. I kept waiting for the family dog to make it into the conversation, the dog that ate the textbook or the dog that ate the classroom notes so he couldn't study for the exam, but the dog never came into the picture. He had a great story to tell and he spun it well, but Mom wasn't buying it. Reasoning has many definitions, but the one I want to focus on for today's leadership insight is this. A reason is a cause, an explanation, or a justification for an action or event. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to sound good and be reasonable. Now, in reality, a reason is nothing more than an excuse. Nothing more, nothing less than an excuse. Rather than admitting we were wrong, we messed up, we made a mistake, we'd rather rationalize and try to justify our own failure. So think about it. The reason is, and then you fill in the blank with the excuse of your choice. You and I, we've probably all done it at some point in our lives. And if you are a parent raising children, I'm sure you've heard that at least once at some point during the raising of your children. But it's not just common folks that do it. Even famous people use, the reason is, and they've got some outlandish excuses, some reasons as they cite for their bad behavior. Let me give you a couple of examples. In 2009, actor Woody Harrelson attacked a TMZ photographer who was trying to take his picture at LaGuardia Airport. The rationale, the reason, the excuse he gave for attacking the photographer and smashing his camera was that he thought, according to a CNN article, the photographer was a zombie. Now, Charlie Sheen, the actor, apparently completely wrecked a hotel room at the Plaza Hotel about a year later. His reason for trashing the room? Well, according to an article in the Huffington Post, Charlie Sheen is quoted as saying he had an allergic reaction to medication. Now, during Winona Ryder's trial for shoplifting, Entertainment Weekly reported that her reason, her rationale, her excuse for shoplifting, this according to testimony by a Saks Fifth Avenue guard who saw her and detained her, was that she was preparing for a movie role and her director had actually told her to, quote, try it out so you can be prepared for this movie role. Again, even famous people can come up with the craziest excuses for bad behavior rather than owning the fact they did something wrong. Now, Ben Franklin once noted that anyone who's good at making excuses is seldom good for anything else. That's a pretty wise statement. Anyone who's good at making excuses is seldom good for anything else. A couple of 100 years later, George Washington Carver noted a similar opinion of people who make rationale or reasoning or excuses. Here's what he said. 95% of all failures come from people who have a habit of making excuses. Now, there's a lot of truth to what Ben and George Washington Carver had to say. And we probably all used those rationales in our lives. Should have, could have, ought have, thought I was going to, maybe, but we've all had reasons and rationales why. So how many times have you and I attempted to rationalize our failure, attempted to minimize in some way the fact that we messed up, blew it up, didn't do it, whatever the rationale behind it, rather than simply owning it, learning from it, and applying what we learned so we don't make the same mistake again. You know, there's an old adage I share when I'm speaking from the stage or training a business or doing some one-on-one coaching, and it's a simple but powerful truth. You've probably heard me say in a prior episode, but if we want to be successful and get ahead in life, it's an adage we've got to acknowledge. And that adage is this: if you do what you've always done, you're going to get the same results you've always gotten. Simply put, in plain old Arkansas English, you will never have more doing the same thing. You're never going to have more if you keep doing the same thing over and over again. Now, if we want to expand that for you that are a little more rational, cognizant, pick the word, this is what it means. You're never going to have more if you think, talk, and act the same way you've always think, talk, and acted, because if you do, nothing's changing in your life, and you're going to get the same thing you've always gotten. Remember, thought precedes action. Action is your saying, you're doing, and you're becoming. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for any period of time, you've heard me say over and over again, as you think, you become. But think about what I just shared. As you think, you say and do, and as you say and do, you become. So simply put, if you think making excuses, you're going to say excuses, you're going to come up with excuses, and you're going to become an excuse maker rather than owning your failure. That means you're never going to have an opportunity to get ahead. You're going to be stuck where you are, as you are, not moving forward. For anything to change in your life, something has to change. But if you're doing the same thing the same way over and over again, Albert Einstein said expecting a different outcome is the very definition of insanity. But here's the problem. If you and I want to say more and do more and become more, we've got to start thinking in a new and different and better way. But the problem is this: it's easier to rationalize. It's easier to make an excuse than it is to commit to change. It's easier to rationalize. It's easy to make an excuse than it is to admit that we were wrong. I don't know if it's pride or ego, but what gets in the way? But until we own our failures, we're destined to repeat them over and over again. You know, I heard it said the other day that making excuses has become so commonplace in culture today, excuse is actually its own unique style of communication. So if you think about that, apparently we love rationalizing our failures because it keeps us from the harsh reality of having to admit that we are to blame, to having to look ourselves in the mirror and point the finger at ourselves and say, you are the problem. But until we're willing to do that, nothing changes in our lives. Now, one of my mentors, Chris Robinson, when someone makes an excuse and says they can't do this or they can't do that, I love what Chris says, and I've quoted it before, and you'll probably hear me quote it again because it's one of my favorite quotes. Chris Robinson says this: it's not that you can't, it's that you won't, and that choice is yours. So if I can't truly means I won't. And when you say I can't, you're saying I won't. You're making a conscious decision to stay stuck, to stay where you are, as you are, unwilling to change. And until you're willing to change, nothing changes in your life. So what's the solution? Well, it's a very simple 4-step process. Number one, you got to stop making excuses. Number two, you got to start owning your failure. Number three, you've got to learn the lessons failure's trying to teach you. And number four, you've got to learn to apply those lessons to your life. Now, when you think about failure, there's a lot of reasons we fail. Lack of effort and a lack of discipline are probably at the top of the chart. Now, that's followed closely by a lack of planning or a lack of persistence. Sometimes it's just an unrealistic expectation or a lack of research, or simply because we fail to raise our hand and ask someone to help us or give us assistance so we can get to the finish line. But whatever the real reason for our failure, note who is responsible. It's always you or I. We are always responsible for our failure. But failure rightly used helps us to grow. It helps us to learn, it helps us to improve, and it helps us become a better version of ourselves by learning what doesn't work so we can not do that again and figure out what does to drive success in our life. And we can do more of the things that drive success rather than the things that drive failure. But it starts with owning our failure and realizing that the root cause of failure stares us back in the mirror every single day. So when you make an excuse or you attempt to rationalize a failure or a mistake, what are you doing? You're trying to absolve yourself of responsibility, of obligation, or duty. Now, I have to ask, how is that helping you? When you choose to say, I didn't do it when you did, you're living a lie. And if you're living a lie, you're really only lying to yourself. Making an excuse is a refusal to challenge the status quo way of thinking that's keeping you where you are and as you are with nothing changing in your life. It's easy to give yourself a reason why to justify rather than admit you were at fault, to learn from it and move on. When you're attempting to justify bad behavior, guess what you're going to get? More bad behavior. You know, thinking back in history, Thomas Edison could have justified 10,000 failures before he finally figured out how to make the incandescent light bulb work. But rather than make excuses, rather than rationalize his failure away, Edison owned it. He learned from it and he kept trying. You know, I love his response when he was being interviewed by a reporter and he was asked about his more than 10,000 failures. His response was great. He said, I didn't fail. I simply discovered 10,000 ways not to create the light bulb. What was he saying? I learned what didn't work so I could scratch that off and keep trying until I found out what did. He understood that, hey, that didn't work. Let's try something new and let's move on. He owned it and he applied it. And ultimately, as we look around today, our homes are lit with the creation that he developed more than 100 years ago. Now, Edison understood this. You will never have more doing the same thing. And if he would have kept doing the same exercise over and over and not changing anything in his experimentation, the incandescent light bulb would never have been created, at least by him. So in the words of John Maxwell, Edison failed early, he failed often, but he kept failing forward. Now, that's one of the reasons, in my opinion, that Thomas Edison became one of the most prolific inventors in modern history. He understood owning failure, learning from it, applying it, and moving forward. Now, me, I love the game of golf. And when I was younger, I played golf a lot. Today, with my travel, not so much. Now, I was meeting with a sales team in California earlier this year, and while I was there, I was invited to go play golf at a local 9-hole course. Now, as expected, it wasn't my best game. I probably hadn't touched a golf club in 2 or 3 years. I mishit a lot of shots and probably lost more than my fair share of balls and left more than a few putts short of the hole. Now, my golf buddies that were with me, they were kind. They kept offering several encouraging comments along the way, but I could either make excuses for my game or I could own the fact that I was out of practice, and it showed. So I chose to own it. I chose to enjoy the time in the beautiful redwood forest of Northern California and simply have a fun day. But then for me, it got a little worse. When I got home, I thought about the fun I had, and I thought, well, let me just go visit one of the local courses, and I bet I can get my game back in shape in one simple round. And I had to ask myself after I got out there, what was I thinking? I chose one of the most difficult golf courses in town, surrounded by water on multiple holes with very tight shots I had to make again and again, and I baptized over a dozen balls in the first 9 holes. So when I got home, my wife asked me how I played, and my response was, I was consistently inconsistent. Well, when she asked what that meant, we had a great laugh, and I told her I did a better job at baptizing golf balls than I did hitting greens in regulation or even hitting the greens at all. Yeah, I could have made an excuse, but I didn't. But I promise you, on the way home, I thought of a lot of them. The reason I put the ball in the lake, I used the wrong club. The reason I put another ball in the lake was I had a bad lie. I put 3 balls in the lake from the tee box because the wind kept pushing my ball towards the water. Yeah, that would have been a perfect shot, except for that tree limb sticking out over the fairway that reached out and grabbed my ball and knocked it to the ground. Man, I thought of a lot of excuses like that along the way, but here's what I learned. All those excuses didn't change the fact that I was out of practice, and it showed. So I could lean into the reason is and fill in the blank, or I could own it. So as someone who's highly competitive and really wanted to lean into that former of making excuses, I knew if I wanted to improve my game, I had to lean into the latter and own that I needed to practice more. This is a lesson you and I can learn and we can all apply to our lives. We've got to own our failures and learn the lesson failure's trying to teach us if we want to say, do, and become more. So let me leave you with a closing thought. Leaders aren't content to stay where they are as they are. Leaders challenge the status quo. They own their failure. They learn from it, and they apply what they've learned so they don't repeat those same mistakes in the future. So you and I, we have a choice. We can keep doing the same things the same way, and nothing's going to change in our lives. We can stay where we are, as we are, stuck, unmoving, and expecting nothing more because we're not going to get any more if we do nothing more. Or we can embrace failure as a teacher. We can learn the lessons failure's trying to teach us, and we can apply those lessons to our lives and keep moving forward. Remember, change is required to create a new and better outcome. So the reason is, as you think, you become. And once you stop thinking, you stop becoming. Maybe Ben Franklin and George Washington Carver were right after all. As you think about failure, you become a failure. But the reverse is also true. As you think about success, you become more successful. And the reason is it all comes down to a mindset, one of failure or one of success. And that choice is yours. So to borrow the words from an ancient Grail knight, guardian of the Holy Grail, having a conversation with Indiana Jones in the movie The Last Crusade, you must choose, but choose wisely. I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Thanks for joining me, and have a great day.